The Blackwood Range is a grid of 36 squares, and I know every rock, creek, and lightning-scarred stump in Sector 7. As a data collector for the Forestry Service, my presence is a ghost in the machine. I hike, I swap SD cards, I replace batteries, and I disappear. I'm not there to track predators or to count deer. I'm there to monitor encroachment, to see if the public is wandering too far into the protected old growth. Most of the time, the cameras capture nothing but the slow, patient growth of the moss. But last Monday, camera 9 broke the pattern. It's mounted on a thick cedar near a dry creek bed. When I checked the footage back at the cabin, I found that at 4:12 a.m., the frame had shifted. There was no blur of a struggle, no vibration of a heavy animal scratching against the bark. The camera simply pivoted. It turned precisely 20 degrees to the north, away from the trail and toward a dense thicket of mountain laurel. I went out the next day to fix it. I checked the straps. They were tight. I checked the tree. The bark was intact. I tightened the mounting bracket until the plastic groaned, and I hiked back. On Wednesday, camera 10 moved. Camera 10 is half a mile further up the ridge. Like the previous one, the timestamp on the card showed 4:12 a.m. The footage showed nothing, just a single smooth motion. The camera turned 20 degrees to the north. I sat at my desk, scrolling through the frames. The logic of the woods is usually simple: wind, weight, or curiosity. But this seemed calculated. I pulled up a map of the sector and drew a line from camera 9 to camera 10. Both were now pointing at the same empty patch of forest, a deep unmapped ravine known as the Sink. The Sink is a topographic nightmare. It's a natural depression where the drainage is poor and the trees grow thick and twisted, competing for the scraps of light that filter through the canopy. There are no trails there. Even the hunters avoid it. The limestone is full of hidden fissures that can swallow a man to his waist. By Friday, 3 more cameras had joined the chorus. Camera 11, 12, and 14. All of them moved exactly at 4:12 a.m., and all of them turned 20 degrees to the north. It was as if an invisible hand was adjusting the focus of a massive, miles-wide lens. Whatever was out there wasn't interested in the cameras. It was using them to frame something. I spent Saturday morning preparing my pack. I shouldn't have been curious, but the precision was an itch I couldn't scratch. If someone was out there setting up camp or dumping waste in the Sink, the cameras were giving me the exact coordinates. Before I left, I checked the final camera in the loop, camera 15. It was the one closest to my cabin, mounted on a pine just 50 yards from my porch. I popped the card into my reader, expecting to see the usual shot of the woodpile. But just like I suspected, the camera also moved, exactly at 4:12 a.m. But it hadn't turned north toward the ravine. It had turned toward my front door. In the infrared light, the porch was a pale, glowing white. The camera was now pointed directly at the window above my bed. I hit play on the 4:12 a.m. clip. The camera housing pivoted with that same mechanical smoothness. It stopped when the window was perfectly centered in the frame. For a full minute, the camera recorded the dark glass of my bedroom. There was no heat signature in the yard. The motion sensor had been triggered by the movement of the camera itself, but whatever was actually turning the device left no trace of its presence. No shadow blocked the lens. No branch moved. I looked at the screen, then back at my front door. The lock was still engaged. The deadbolt was thrown. But the feeling of being watched doesn't care about locks. I looked back at the map. The lines from the other cameras all converged on a single point in the center of the Sink. A point where the trees were so thick the satellite imagery was just a blur of dark green. I grabbed my GPS and my heavy-duty flashlight. I didn't want to go into the ravine, but the cameras had stopped being observers. They became pointers. Something was inviting me to a specific spot in the woods, and for the first time in 3 years, I realized that I wasn't the one collecting data. I was the data. The hike to the Sink took 3 hours. And with every mile, the forest felt like I was closing a door behind me. The further I drifted from the established trails, the more the sounds of the mountain began to flatten. The wind, which usually roared through the high ridges, became a dull rhythmic thrumming by the time I reached the edge of the limestone depression. It was 2 p.m. when I stood at the rim. Below me, the ground fell away into a jagged bowl of gray rock and suffocating greenery. The cedar trees here didn't grow straight. They're spiraled, their trunks twisting as if trying to unscrew themselves from the earth. I checked my GPS. According to the lines I'd drawn from the cameras, the convergence point was another 600 yards into the thickest part of the basin. The descent was a scramble over loose shale and rotting logs that disintegrated under my boots like wet cardboard. Halfway down, the silence changed. It became heavy, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. I stopped to catch my breath and looked back up at the rim. Through the gaps in the canopy, I saw a familiar shape. High on a trunk overlooking the ravine was camera 13. I hadn't checked this one yet. It was pointed straight down at me. I pulled myself up to the tree, unlatched the housing, and took out the SD card. I didn't want to wait until I got home. I popped it into my handheld viewer and scrolled to the 4:12 a.m. timestamp. The camera didn't just tilt, it tracked. On the screen, I watched the camera pivot in a slow, smooth arc. It followed the path through the brush that I had just walked. But the trail was empty. The infrared didn't pick up a heat signature, yet the tall grass parted in a distinct line, and a heavy branch of mountain laurel bent low as if something massive were pushing past it. The exact camera position when it stopped was the spot where I was currently standing. I looked at the screen, then the ground at my feet. There were no tracks, no flattened grass. I was standing in a pristine patch of forest, yet the footage told me that something had been here, exactly 24 hours ago, standing right where I was. I put the camera back and kept moving. I had to see what was in the center. The deeper I went, the stranger the woods became. I started finding markers. They weren't made of stone or wood. In a clearing near the bottom, I found a series of saplings that had been tied together. They hadn't been knotted with rope. Their own branches had been woven into an intricate geometric braid that shouldn't have been possible with living wood. Then, I found the cameras. Not my cameras. I found theirs. In the center of the sink, there was a circle of ancient, hollowed-out hemlocks. Fastened to the bark of each tree, at exactly eye level, were dozens of small black boxes. At first, I thought they were a rival research team's equipment. But as I drew closer, I realized they weren't manufactured. The cameras were made of polished obsidian and bone. They had no lenses, just deep dark apertures that seemed to swallow the light. There were hundreds of them, all mounted with the same precision as my Forestry Service units. Every single one of them was pointed at a large flat limestone slab in the center of the clearing. I walked to the edge of the slab. It was stained with something dark and tacky, but it didn't smell like blood. It smelled like the copper scent of the smoke from the lookout towers, metallic and ancient. I looked up at the circle of the obsidian eyes. I felt a sudden, cold realization. My cameras hadn't been moved by a creature. They were probably just being integrated. My technology was being drafted into a much older system of observation. I reached out to touch one of the bone-cased boxes, but I froze. From the shadows of the hemlock, a sound rose. It wasn't a growl or a breath. It was a click, a sharp, mechanical click that sounded exactly like the shutter of a trail camera. Then another one. The sound circled the clearing, moving through the trees at a speed no animal could achieve. Something was taking my picture. Something was documenting my presence from every angle of the circle. I turned in a slow circle, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but I saw nothing. No movement, no heat, no shifting shadows, just the relentless, rhythmic clicking of the shutters. I looked at my watch. It was 6 a.m. I looked at the obsidian cameras again. They weren't just observing me, they were waiting. That's when I realized that the 4:12 a.m. marker wasn't the time the creature came out. It was the time the film was being developed. I turned and began to run back toward the rim, but the ravine felt different now. Every path I had taken down was gone. Every time I crested a rise, I found myself looking back down at the limestone slab and the circle of bone cameras. The woods weren't just a place anymore, they were a gallery, and I was the only exhibit left. Panic is a loud thing, but the ravine was louder. As I scrambled up the shale slopes, the clicking followed me. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a physical sensation, a sharp prickling on the back of my neck every time a shutter snapped. I reached the rim of the sink as the sun began to bleed out behind the jagged peaks of the Blackwood Range. The light was falling fast, turning the twisted cedars into reaching skeletal hands. I didn't stop. I ran toward my cabin, my breath tearing at my throat in jagged frozen gulps. I burst through my front door at 6 p.m. and slammed the deadbolt home. I leaned against the heavy oak, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Finally, I was safe. I had a roof, 4 walls, and a lock. But as I stood there in the dark, I looked at the monitor on my desk. The screen was glowing, but I didn't remember turning it on. I walked over, my boots tracking dried limestone mud across the floor. The mapping software was open. The lines I had drawn, the convergence point from the cameras, they had changed. They were no longer pointing to the center of the sink. All of the lines were moving in real time. On the screen, the icons for camera 9, 10, 11, and 12 were rotating, slowly, methodically. They were tracking something moving through the woods. The lines intersected at a single point that was crawling steadily across the map toward the icon labeled home. Something was following my scent, and the cameras were its eyes. I lunged for the power cord and ripped it from the wall. The monitor died, but the room didn't get any darker. Outside, through the window above my bed, the woods were bathed in a rhythmic, pulsing silver. Flash. I froze. Flash. I crawled to the window and peered over the sill. 50 yards away, camera 15, the one pointed at my bedroom, was firing its infrared strobe. It wasn't waiting for motion. It was strobing every 2 seconds, illuminating the yard in bursts of invisible light that I could see as a faint purple hum in the air. In the flashes, the yard was empty, but the tall grass near the porch was flattening. Step by step, flash. A depression in the weeds, flash. A footprint in the mud that wasn't there a second ago. There was no sound of footsteps, no heavy breathing, just the relentless mechanical snick-click of the camera. I backed away from the window, retreating into the kitchen. I grabbed my service axe from the wall, the weight of the steel cold and grounding in my hands. I realized then that the creature didn't want to eat me. It didn't want to kill me. It wanted to record me. I was a specimen, a rare find in its territory, and it was finishing the collection. The clock on the stove ticked over. It was 4:11 a.m. I had lost hours. I had been standing in the dark, paralyzed as the night bled away. 4:12 a.m. The clicking stopped. The strobing light outside died. The silence that rushed back in was so heavy it felt like water filling my lungs. Then, the floorboards on the porch groaned. It wasn't a heavy weight. It was the sound of something precisely placed. I stood in the center of the kitchen, my axe raised, and my eyes locked on the front door. I expected the wood to splinter. I expected a claw or a shoulder to heave against the frame. Instead, I heard the sound of the mailbox slot on the door rattling. Something thin and cold slid through the metal slit. It fluttered through the door like a dead leaf. I didn't move for 10 minutes. The sun began to gray the edges of the sky, casting a dim, dusty light into the cabin. Only then did I lower the axe and approach the door. Lying on the rug was a photograph. It wasn't a digital print. It was a thin, translucent sheet of what looked like dried skin, but the image on it was as clear as a mirror. It was a photo of me. I was standing in the kitchen, holding the axe, but the perspective was from inside the cabin. The photo had been taken from the corner of the ceiling, directly behind where I had been standing all night. I looked up at the corner. There was nothing there. No camera, no obsidian box, just a small dark hole in the wood where the sap had leaked out. I turned the photo over. On the back, there were no words, just a series of 15-degree tally marks scratched into the paper with a sharp, precise point. I walked to the window and looked out. The woods were still. The cameras were back in their original positions, leveled with the horizon, watching the trails for deer and bobcats as if nothing had happened. I went to the desk and picked up my pen. I opened my logbook, but I didn't write about the creature. I didn't write about the ravine or the obsidian eyes. I wrote my resignation. I packed my bags and left the cabin by 7 a.m. I didn't look back at the trees. I didn't check the cameras on my way out. I kept my eyes on the road, on the asphalt, on the world of man. But as I drove down the mountain, I checked my rearview mirror. Every mile, at the edge of the tree line, I saw a flash, a small silver spark of light reflected off a lens. They weren't my cameras. They were high up in the canopy, tucked into the shadows where no one would ever climb. I'm in the city now. There are cameras on every street corner. There are cameras on the buses and the elevators and on the front of every house. People tell me I'm safe here. They tell me that in the city, you're never truly alone. That's what I'm afraid of. Sometimes I still wake up at 4:12 a.m. I don't hear a monster. I don't hear a scream. But I can hear the sound of a shutter closing somewhere inside the walls of my apartment. And when I check the mirror, I notice that the furniture in my living room has been moved. Just a little. Exactly 20 degrees north.